If a Muslim actually cared about what happens to you after you die, he would not tell you about Islam. That's the claim. Preaching Islam to someone doesn't just carry risk for that person, it makes their condemnation more likely, and Islam's own sources say so. The Quran states that Allah does not punish a people until a messenger reaches them. That means the person who has never heard of Muhammad is walking around excused. The moment someone preaches to him, that excuse is gone, and he now stands under a judgment he did not stand under an hour before. Dawah is the thing that switches most people from probably safe to possibly damned. So if a Muslim genuinely wanted the best outcome for the people around him, silence would be the loving option, and preaching would be the cruel one. In this video, I'm going to build that case entirely from the Quran, the hadith, and Islam's own classical sources. And by the end, you'll see why spreading Islam is bad for the people it reaches, and why every school of Sunni Islam has no way to say otherwise. So, before I start, I just want to make a few things clear. First, you don't need to be a Christian to run this argument. Every premise comes straight from Islamic sources, so an atheist could run it just as well. And most Christian denominations walk out of this dilemma untouched, all because of Jesus Christ. A story for a possible future video. If you want me to make it, tell me in the comments below. Second, the problem exists for both Sunni and Shia Islam alike. But today, we're working through the three main Sunni creeds: the Ash'ari school, the Maturidi school, and the Athari school. Each one will try a different way out and ultimately fail. My claim is this, as stated as directly as I can put it. Dawah does not make a person more likely to reach paradise. It makes him less likely to reach it. Telling a man about Muhammad does not add a chance at salvation. It removes the one excuse that was covering him and hands him a liability with nothing guaranteed in exchange. That's not a side effect buried in the system. That is the system. And I'm going to build the whole thing out of pieces Islam already owns. Here's how we get there. Most, if not all, Muslims will affirm 4 propositions straight from their own sources. Once those 4 are granted, the dilemma assembles itself, and he's left with exactly 3 ways out. He can deny his own sources, he can admit that Islam cannot guarantee Dawah improves one's salvation, or he can claim that whenever Dawah takes away a person's excuse, grounded in ignorance, Allah always makes up for it. That every single person who hears the message is also given an extra push of help to accept it. So hearing can never leave anyone worse off. It's a nice thought, but it's just a claim. The truth is that you can't point to an ayah or a hadith that actually promises it. So the Muslim would be inventing the very rule he needs to escape the problem. Keep those 3 exits in mind, because the 3 major creeds of Sunni Islam is going to reach for one of them and come up empty. And before anyone thinks that I'm misrepresenting the Islamic view, I'll leave a link to my sources below in the description. Phase 1 is about agreement, and it's the easy part. Before you make a single accusation, you get a Muslim to affirm 4 propositions, and every one of them comes from sources he already trusts. Most Muslims will grant all 4 without hesitation, because refusing them means arguing with the clear Quran and already well-established doctrines. Proposition 1. Allah does not punish people who never received a messenger. Surah 17, ayah 15 says, "We do not punish until we have sent a messenger." That's the Quran itself, the highest tier of authority in Islam. And Muslims quote this verse constantly in their own apologetics as proof of divine justice. You're not springing anything on them yet. Pay attention to what the verse actually requires, though. Accountability needs actual notice, meaning a real and adequate presentation of the message that reached this specific person, not the theoretical availability of Islam somewhere on the internet. A billboard he drove past does not count, and neither does a headline, because the standard the tradition sets is an adequate presentation, and that standard will matter enormously later. This is clearly outlined in the book Between Heaven and Hell by Muhammad Hassan Khalil. Proposition 2. Communities are not held accountable while unaware. Surah 6, ayah 131 says Allah would not destroy towns or wrongdoing while their people were unaware. In plain terms, ignorance is an excuse. The moment ignorance ends, the excuse ends with it, and that single mechanism is the pivot the entire dilemma turns on. Proposition 3. Every human being is born on the fitra, an innate pull toward the one God. Surah 30, Ayah 30 commands believers to adhere to the fitra of Allah upon which He has created all people. And an authentic hadith in Bukhari 1385 adds that every child is born upon the fitra, and then his parents make him a Jew or a Christian or a Zoroastrian. But notice the gap between instinct and obligation. The fitra points a person toward God, yet it doesn't deliver the content of Islamic law. Which is why Ibn Kathir, commenting on Surah 11, Ayah 17, can say, the fitra accepts the Sharia, while the tradition still insists that actual knowledge of Islam is required before anyone can consciously accept it. The compass is real, but it can be obscured, and on its own it saves nobody. Proposition 4. The Quran is proof, and it cuts both ways. Muhammad said the Quran is a proof either for you or against you. A hadith graded authentic and carried in both al-Nasai and Sahih Muslim. Now consider what that is admitting. Knowledge of the Quran is not automatically good for the person who receives it, because by Islam's own account, the book can become evidence against its hearers. Notice what we've collected so far, because the 4 pieces fit together with almost no pressure from you. Ignorance excuses, knowledge obligates. The innate compass is not enough on its own, and the book itself can testify for or against the person holding it. Each proposition sounded harmless when they affirmed it, and every one of them came out of their own tradition's mouth. Once those 4 propositions are on the table, the crucial question becomes, what happens to a person's status before Allah at the exact moment adequate knowledge of Islam reaches him? Now here's the rub. Their own sources are about to answer it in a way that most of them won't like, because those sources built a whole category of people around this exact question. Classical Islam calls that category al-Fatrah, the people of the interval. The term covers everyone who never received an adequate presentation of Islam, and the net is wider than most Muslims assume. It includes people who lived in the gaps between messengers, people who never heard of Muhammad at all, people who only ever heard a distorted version of his message, and people who caught the name Islam without ever hearing its actual content. Look closely at how the category is defined. It's not about geography, and it's not about the calendar. The scholars differed over exactly who qualifies, with some restricting it to people in a literal gap between the prophets, and others extending it to anyone against whom the divine proof was never properly established. But the threshold they kept returning to is whether the hujjah, that divine proof, actually landed on a person. Catching the word Islam in a headline does not establish the hujjah, and a lifetime of caricatures and distortions may not establish it either, which is why some scholars kept even people in Muslim majority regions inside the category. That distinction belongs to the tradition itself, so nobody can accuse you of importing it from outside. The next question is, what happens to these people? And on that question, the tradition splits 4 ways. Position 1 says they're excused in this life and will be tested on the day of judgment, which is the view of al-Tabari, al-Bayhaqi, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn al-Qayyim. And contemporary fatwa bodies often call it the strongest opinion. A second camp says they're condemned despite never hearing the message, a position associated with scholars like Ibn Abd al-Bar and al-Qurtubi, who argued that the hereafter is a realm of recompense rather than new obligation. A third camp says they die saved precisely because the message never reached them, a reading linked with Ash'ari and Shafi'i authorities and represented by al-Suyuti. And a fourth camp refuses to rule at all, leaving their fate suspended under the will of Allah. These views are outlined in a peer-reviewed article in a journal of Islamic studies. More information in the description below. With all these views present, you don't need to pick a winner among those 4 positions, and you shouldn't try to. 4 contradictory rulings on the exact same question is the point. They are not considered outside the pale of Islam if they held those positions, which means the tradition never settled it, not once in 14 centuries. A tradition that can't agree what happens to the unreached has no business guaranteeing what happens once they're reached. That brings us to the step everything else hangs on. And I'd encourage you to slow down when you reach it in a real conversation. The moment a person receives adequate dawah, he exits the al-Fatrah permanently. His ignorance is gone, so the excuse built on that ignorance is gone, and there's no road back into the category at all. Nobody can unhear a message, and no amount of regret restores the status of the unaware. Whatever protection that category carried, whether excusal, a future test, or suspended judgment, the da'i just stripped it away with a single conversation. The only open question is what the person received in exchange, and that question is where the dilemma finally shows its teeth. Put the before and the after side by side, and the dilemma states itself. Before adequate dawah, a person may be excused. The hujjah hasn't been established against him. His fitra is still operative. And under Surah 17, he isn't liable for rejecting a message he never adequately received. After adequate dawah, the same person must accept Muhammad as messenger, accept the Quran as revelation, and submit to the Sharia. If he rejects, the rejection is now culpable and grounds for condemnation exist that didn't exist the day before. If he accepts, salvation only becomes possible, but nothing about it is guaranteed. Now walk the logic in 5 steps, slowly, because the Muslim you're talking to has already granted every single one of them, and the slower you take it, the harder the conclusion lands. First, some people may escape condemnation without explicit knowledge of Islam, whether through excusal, the fitra, divine mercy, or a test after death. The tradition itself says so in 4 different ways. Second, an adequate presentation of Islam imposes obligations that weren't there before, namely belief in Muhammad specifically, acceptance of the Quran, and submission to Islamic law. Third, rejecting those obligations after an adequate presentation creates grounds for condemnation that did not previously exist. Fourth, nothing about receiving the message guarantees that the person will accept it. So fifth, dawah can remove an excuse and create grounds for condemnation while guaranteeing nothing in return. That chain yields a precise claim, and I want you to memorize it word for word. Dawah does not make paradise more likely. It makes it less likely because it converts a person the tradition might excuse into a person the tradition must condemn if he refuses. And nothing in the system guarantees that he won't refuse. The outcome isn't a coin flip you can shrug off and move on from. The tradition's own principles built this outcome, and the preacher owns it the moment he opens his mouth. You don't need to prove Dawah destroys every hearer to make this case, because the case never needed that much. You only need to show that Islam cannot promise the opposite, and it can't. So calling Dawah mercy is a claim its own sources refuse to back up. At this point, the Muslim has to respond, and Sunni Islam gives him at least 3 creeds to respond from. We'll take them one at a time, and we'll start with the school where the dilemma bites the hardest, because that school happens to be the most generous one. The Ash'ari school is the most explicit of the 3 about excusing the unreached, and that generosity is exactly what exposes it. This is the dominant theological school across much of the Sunni world, so there's a good chance the Muslim you're talking to holds some version of its positions, whether he knows the label or not. Al-Ghazali makes the case most directly. In his book, The Faisal, Ghazali argues that God's mercy will encompass most Byzantine Christians and Turks because their lands lie far beyond the lands of Islam, and their rejection of the Prophet could hardly be called informed. The scholar Muhammad Hassan Khalil, who documented this in his study of Islamic salvation theology, puts it sharply. He writes, Ghazali makes damnation the exception for people inadequately exposed to Islamic revelation. That's the plain Ash'ari position on revelation and accountability, grounded directly in Surah 17, Ayah 15. Only those who received the final message in its authentic form are culpable for not heeding it. Even al-Baghdadi, no friend of theological laxity, granted that an unreached person who reasons his way to the unity of God can attain paradise. Now run the dilemma straight through that doctrine. Before Dawah, Ghazali's Byzantine Christian may be saved through mercy because the Hujjah was never established against him. After Dawah, that same man must accept Muhammad or face condemnation. The missionary took a man in non-culpable ignorance and converted him into a candidate for culpable rejection. And no one at any point guaranteed that he would accept it. On Ghazali's own numbers, most of those Byzantine Christians were headed for mercy. So a successful Ash'ari missionary campaign through Constantinople would have moved an entire population from probable mercy into live jeopardy. Let me steelman the Ash'ari response to this. He'll say that greater revelation brings greater opportunity and greater reward. So the hearer's position improved the moment the message arrived. It sounds reasonable, but opportunity is not a guarantee. And the difference between those two words is the whole argument. Unless Allah promises that everyone who receives adequate revelation also receives sufficient grace to accept it, the new knowledge remains fully capable of worsening the person's final position. And here, the Ash'ari school's own theology turns on it. This is the school most committed to absolute divine sovereignty, in which Allah creates both the act and the will behind the act, so a hearer doesn't even generate his own acceptance. On that doctrine, there is no mechanism by which a missionary can take or make grace follow knowledge, because both the knowledge arriving and the heart responding are Allah's direct creations, and Allah has promised no linkage between them. Their own religion says that whoever Allah guides, no one can lead astray, and whoever Allah misleads, none can guide. Now, put the da'i back in the picture. He controls the message and controls nothing else. He is handing a man a document that will either be used for him or against him at judgment, with no ability to influence which one. And the school that excuses the unreached most generously has just made the delivery of that document the riskiest act in its entire system. Maybe the Athari school escapes, because it has something the Ash'aris don't. Ibn Taymiyyah, the school's towering authority, taught that those who never received the message or received only a distorted version of it will be tested by Allah on the day of judgment. The reports describe that test concretely, with the unreached commanded to enter a fire that turns out to be cool and safe for everyone who obeys in faith, while those who refuse are dragged into the real one. Ibn al-Qayyim, his greatest student, defended the same view, and contemporary fatwa councils often call it the strongest position on the question. Scholars call this eschatological inclusivism, and on the surface it looks like it dissolves the dilemma entirely. If the unreached get their test anyway, then Dawah just moves the test earlier. Nobody's odds change, and the missionary is simply delivering in this life what Allah would have delivered in the next. That reply is clever, and I want you to see exactly why it fails. Ibn Taymiyyah closed that door himself in writing. In his compilation of fatwa, he declares that Allah sent Muhammad and accepts no religion from anyone whom the call to Islam has reached except the religion Muhammad brought, and that everyone for whom the proof of Muhammad's prophethood has been established, human or jinn, who then does not believe in him, deserves the punishment of Allah. The statement is not an opponent's summary of his view. Those are his own words, preserved in his own collected rulings. So assemble the Athari position from its own parts. The unreached receives a test on the day of judgment, and the outcome of that test is unknown. The people who were reached by Islam and who reject it receive no such test, because for them the verdict has already been entered, which means those who spread Islam is not improving anyone's chances on this model. He is deleting a future test and replacing it with present accountability. If the hero would have passed the Judgment Day test, Dawah may have cost him paradise. If he would have failed it, Dawah changed nothing at all. There is no third row on that table where Dawah demonstrably made things better. Run those two outcomes past your Muslim interlocutor and ask him to name the scenario where the preaching helped. The only candidate is the hearer who accepts Islam in this life. But that man might have also obeyed on the judgment day, when the test came from Allah directly instead of through a fallible stranger with a pamphlet. On Ibn Taymiyyah's own model, the missionary swapped a test administered by God for a presentation administered by himself, and he has no way to show that the exchange was in the hearer's favor. And this is smart because he realizes that if Allah's test is easier than submitting after dawah in this life, then it's better to do the test. So no dawah. But if it puts them at a detriment, then Allah's test is skewed towards failure for no reason, making him unjust. Ibn Kathir confirms how severe the post-dawah side of the ledger is. Commenting on Surah 11, he writes that the warning of the fire is directed at everyone on the face of the earth who disbelieves in the Quran, whether idolaters, people of the scripture, or any other group, applying to all whom the Quran reaches, regardless of color, appearance, or nationality. The reach of Islam is the reach of the liability. That is the strictest school in Sunni Islam, describing its own system, and the door it welded shut was its only exit. One school remains, and it starts from a different place entirely. The Maturidi school teaches that every rational human being is obligated to find faith in the Maker through reason alone, a doctrine with roots going back to Abu Hanifa himself, who held people accountable for ignoring the clear signs of creation. Later Maturidi scholars refined the point, with al-Bazdawi explaining that reason works as the cause that brings a person to the knowledge of Allah, even though Allah is the one who establishes the obligation. What the school calls faith by al-Jumla, meaning that it can be valid and salvific even without the specific doctrinal content of Islam. A man on an island who reasons his way to the one creator may already stand in a saved state before any missionary arrives. And no other Sunni school grants the unreached that much. You can probably see what happens next. Rational monotheism only counts as enough while the specific message hasn't arrived. The moment Dawah reaches that island, the man's general faith stops being sufficient because now he's obligated to accept Muhammad, the Quran, his angels, his messengers, the last day, and Qadr. And then there is the Sharia in their specifics, along with performing Salah, Zakah, fasting, and Hajj. A person who was potentially saved on Monday becomes more likely condemned on Tuesday. And the only thing that changed in between was that somebody told him about Islam. The Maturidi framework didn't dissolve the dilemma, it sharpens the blade. And the school's modern voices push it further still. Some contemporary Maturidi thinkers argue that in a world of global information access, there may be nobody left to whom Islam hasn't reached, which would erase the excusal category entirely and make every living non-Muslim fully accountable. Think about that claim for a second. If the internet established the Hujjah against the whole planet, then billions of people who've only ever encountered Islam through headlines and half-truths are now counted as informed rejectors. The school's own logic is marching toward a world where the excuse of ignorance no longer exists for anyone, and it produced that conclusion without any help from critics like me. A framework that starts by crediting the lone rational monotheist ends by condemning him the moment Wi-Fi reaches his island. There's one more move on the table, and it deserves a straight answer. The concept is Istidraj, drawn from Surah 7, ayat 181 to 183, where Allah says those who reject his signs, that he will lead them gradually toward destruction in ways they do not perceive. Applied here, the objection says that the rejection itself was istidraj. Allah already knew this person would reject the message, sent the da'i anyway, and the rejection just revealed what was always true of his heart. On this reading, Dawah never worsened anyone's position because the destruction was decreed before the preacher ever opened his mouth. In fact, it was decreed from within their mother's wombs. that objection collapses under its own sources. If Allah sends a message knowing in advance it will harden the hearer, then Surah 17, Ayah 15 stops meaning what it says. The messenger wasn't a genuine offer. He was a delivery mechanism for a punishment already decided, which turns the verse, "We do not punish until we have sent a messenger," into a description of method, not a promise of mercy. Surah 6, Ayah 131 fares no better, because the person is being punished through the very knowledge that verse promised would excuse him. Allah didn't wait for awareness to end the exemption, He engineered the awareness to end it. Istidraj doesn't defend Dawah, it turns Dawah into the mechanism of damnation and calls it kindness, all while the Da'i is on his way out the door, and the Muslim making his move has no way to run it in practice. He can't see into the unseen, so he can't tell you which hearer in front of him is being tested toward acceptance and which is being hardened toward the fire. He isn't defending Dawah as mercy anymore. He's admitting he can't tell mercy from destruction until after the fact. So put it to him directly. He's saying Dawah might be Istidraj, a test that leads to destruction. That means he cannot know whether preaching Islam to the person in front of him improves his eternal fate or ends it. How then does he justify Dawah as a religious obligation? There's a second problem to this argument, and it turns toward the Da'i himself. The specific obligation Dawah imposes is the second clause of the Shahada, the declaration that Muhammad is the messenger of God. And the entire weight of the dilemma hangs on whether accepting that clause can be guaranteed to lead anywhere good. Notice that Allah never even offers the Muslim himself that assurance. Guidance belongs to Allah alone as his sovereign act. And the tashahhud formula recited inside Islamic prayer says that whoever Allah guides, none can lead astray, and whomever Allah misleads, none can guide. A Muslim repeats that line in his daily prayers, which means the uncertainty I'm describing is something he confesses on his knees several times a day. The Quran keeps the same distance. In Surah 42, Ayah 15, Muhammad is told to say to the people of the book, "For us are our deeds, and for you, your deeds," which is a statement of separation rather than a promise of arrival. Allah warns believers against presuming their own place in paradise, and it hands no exemptions for missionaries. Even Muhammad himself, in the famous hadith of Jibril, admitted that he knew no more than his questioner about the timing of the hour, when and where people will die, which tells you how tightly the unseen is held. Now, assemble what that means for Dawah. A Muslim performing Dawah cannot guarantee his own salvation, let alone the salvation of the person he's targeting. He is imposing obligations he cannot make sure will be met on behalf of a God whose decisions he cannot guarantee, with eternal consequences he cannot control. Don't believe me? Just read Sahih Bukhari 5 and 3. The uncertainty isn't a gap sitting at the edge of the system of somewhere in the distance where the Muslim can just ignore it. It is the core of maintaining the freedom that Allah has in determining whether someone goes to paradise or hell, regardless of deeds. And a man who cannot vouch for his own arrival destination has no business selling tickets to someone else. Let's put it all together, because the Muslim now faces a trilemma, and every horn belongs to his own deen. Option A follows the Ash'ari and Maturidi excusal doctrines and grants that the unreached may be saved, which means Dawah strips that excusal and hands the hearer a worse position than the one he had before anyone preached it to him. Option B follows Ibn Taymiyyah and grants that the unreached face a judgment day test, which means Dawah deletes that test and replaces it with immediate accountability. But if the test gives the person a leg up, then it's better to do the test. If it puts them at a disadvantage, then Allah's test is skewed harder for no reason, making him unjust. Option C declares that the unreached are condemned regardless, which is the only option where Dawah could actually help. Except Surah 17 and Surah 6 directly contradict it, and the tradition never reached consensus on it across 14 centuries. All those options fail, and none of them was manufactured by me. Every option comes from inside Sunni Islam, and every one of them ends with Dawah either creating new liability, deleting a safer path to judgment, or resting on a position the Quran itself denies. The honest conclusion isn't that Dawah is risky or complicated. It's that Dawah makes a person's position before Allah worse, not better. And a religion that can't show otherwise has no basis calling its own missionary a work of mercy. Spreading Islam on Islam's own terms is bad for the people it reaches. The three exits from the start of this video are gone. Denying the sources means throwing out the Quran and the Sunnah. Admitting the uncertainty means admitting Dawah is a gamble with someone else's eternity. Claiming a compensating grace for every hearer means asserting a guarantee that doesn't exist anywhere in the Quran. Every single plank in this case comes from sources a Muslim already calls sacred, so there's no hostile premise to reject and no disputed translation to hide behind. Ask the Muslim directly on what basis he calls Dawah mercy, rather than a risk he's imposing on another person without that person's consent, when he can't guarantee it improves anyone's eternal outcome, and his own tradition's principles say that it might even make things worse. He has two moves left: deny his sources or admit uncertainty. Whichever one he reaches for, he's no longer guaranteeing Dawah is good because he lacks that epistemic certainty. To say you know if a person will die a Muslim tomorrow is to violate one of the 5 keys of the unseen. So consider an agnostic who believes that there may be a God but you can't know, or even an atheist who does not believe in God because he is unconvinced. That person is still better off not knowing anything about Islam because his true ignorance could save him. That person isn't going around committing horrific crimes, and even if he does steal or cheat, most people recognize that it's wrong and it's behavior that needs to be changed. This still acknowledges the Islamic sense of fitra, and under their paradigm is enough to give them a fighting chance into paradise. Also, this same person has objectively less rules or laws to follow than the Muslim who has to uphold the 5 pillars of Islam and adhere to the 6 articles of Iman and keep the Sharia. And this, by the way, is uncontroversial. It's agreed upon and based upon the hadiths compiled by Nawawi. All the message of Islam will do is hogtie the well-intentioned atheist, agnostic, or even polytheist who is not able to use reason to find the one God with new burdens they have to carry in order to make it to paradise. And even then, they are not guaranteed. A person, according to Sahih Muslim 2651, can do good deeds for 90% of their life, but if they fail in the last 10%, they will go to hell, and vice versa. Either way, at this point, according to Islam's own tenets, Dawah is akin to war that is waged on a cosmic scale, where lives aren't just robbed, they are damned for eternity.